Is it good? Yes. Want more info? Yes. Don't give a crap about unboxing crap? Then the video starts at 8 minutes and 50 seconds. February 13th, 2020, and the 10th anniversary edition of Project DIVA Megamix for Switch has dropped. I thought we'd take a quick look at the contents of this marvelous package while we wait for the controllers to arrive. Ordered direct from Sega's store Ebten, which included a tapestry and 4 badges as a pre-order bonus. Wow, I got far before the next delivery arrived. NSW-230, the dedicated controller for Nintendo Switch, has arrived. PS4 161 for the PS4 as well. But before opening HORI's controllers, back to opening the new Switch game. While I open stuff, I feel a bit redundant to just narrate what I'm doing, like, and here we have me picking up some badges. I mean, this is a video, not a blind podcast, right? So, a bit of history. There has been quite a number of games produced by Sega now. For the most part, the Project DIVA series were exclusive to Sony. We are only just now seeing a title branded Project DIVA released on a non-Sony console. Going by the Japanese release dates, well, there is a lot. In 2009, Project DIVA released July 2nd on PSP. Then, 2010, Project DIVA Arcade released in January, in the arcades. There was also like a whole bunch of DLC packs for various games, but I'm not going to mention all of those because that would just take eternity. But the first 2 came with minigames. Dreamy Theater for PS3, which requires a PSP with a Project DIVA save to be connected to the PS3 via a USB cable just to play, released June 24th. Project DIVA 2nd, July 29th for PSP. Then Project DIVA Dreamy Theater 2nd, August 4th, which required a PSP connection but only to unlock things, not every freaking time you play. In 2011, Project DIVA Extend released November 10th, also for PSP. Then in 2012, we had Miku Flick, March 9th, a smartphone game, Project DIVA F, August 30th on Vita, and March 7th on PS3. Project Mirai, which is not a Project DIVA series game, March 8th for the 3DS, featuring Nendoroid models. There was also Miku Flick 2, August 10th for your smartphone. And Project DIVA Dreamy Theater Extend, PS3, September 13th, which also required the PSP version save file. In 2013, November 21st, the arcades upgraded to Future Tone, which adds the touch slider, which is why not all songs use it. Also, Project Mirai 2 released November 28th for 3DS. In 2014, Project DIVA F 2nd released March 27th for both Vita and PS3. 2015 had the release of Project Mirai DX on 3DS, which could have just been a patch for Project Mirai 2, but was geared for international release.
This is strange. They've removed the first set of buttons on Deluxe's note chart. Why?
Released on May 28th. In 2016, we saw Project DIVA X, March 24th on Vita, August 25th on PS4, and Project DIVA Future Sound and Colorful Tone launched on June 23rd. These were download only, and is when everything got weird in my opinion. Although, mind you, the Dreamy Theater series was kinda weird. There is also Miku VR for PlayStation VR, releasing 3 stages on October 13th, November 10th and December 15th. In 2017, Project DIVA Future Tone DX, the physical combined copy of Future Sound and Colorful Tone, released November 22nd. And then there's Project Sekai, Colorful Stage, featuring Hatsune Miku, which isn't exclusively a Miku title, but looks a lot like the arcade game Tunithm, but for your smartphone. Pre-registrations start late April. That's very soon. Moving on to HORI. HORI has created several iterations of Project DIVA controllers now. A big controller for Dreamy Theater 2nd, then the Project DIVA F full-size controller, which I did a couple of videos on. Let's try it! F Mini, both black and white versions, F Second Mini in a funky yellow, X Mini, which is the first to work on PS4 natively, Future Tone Mini, which changed the button layout, alleviating some issues with trying to use these controllers for Future Tone. And now, finally, a full-sized Future Tone controller 10 years after the first game released, or 9 years since the PS3 Dreamy Theater 2nd controller. Interestingly, the box shows what production number out of how many of these were made. I'm opening the 251st out of 2,755 manufactured. Serebii edition? Nice! I got the 300th of 1,000 for the Switch. The other 2 PS4 boxes are like 172 and 254. Nice, low numbers here. Yay! Curiously, the numbers are kind of all over the place, so in no way resembles my place in placing an order for these. I wonder who got the 39th model. If that were me, I wouldn't want to open it. When playing Future Tone, without an actual arcade controller, I can't enjoy the note chart patterns as they were designed, and instead find myself theorizing as to how is the best way I can configure buttons on the controller to play the game to compensate. Hisoke and the others have obviously mastered this art, but having played at the arcades, I just can't get this out of my head as some sort of awkward issue. I went beyond reconfiguring the PS4 controller and instead found myself doing other things like busting out a third-party adapter to use the PS3 arcade controller on the PS4, but that added an input delay. I then started using a fight stick, as it had a line of 4 buttons that wouldn't jam until an official mini controller was released for the PS4. But even then, I had to come up with alternatives as to how to cope with the slide notes and fast notes, and it just always felt a little awkward compared to the arcade experience. The really fast notes were practically impossible in an arcade fighting stick. Nearly 7 years after the epic-sized PS3 controller released, a full-size, dedicated arcade controller is here. I'm excited, but my first worry is that the touch panel implementation will be all over the show, or over a few months will prove to be finicky. You see, eventually the F full-size controller's touch panel eventually triggered even when you're not touching it, failed to trigger, or trigger multiple times when you try to use it, easily dropping your combo. As a result, in the end, I really enjoyed it pretty much exclusively for Dreamy Theater on PS3, as in those titles, it was strictly the face buttons, no touch panel or analog sticks to worry about. So I hope you enjoyed a look at the boxes of the controller and the Switch 10th Anniversary Edition contents. The badges, box, free song download via Sonica, music CDs and booklet, game guide, game, and tapestry. On to the nitty-gritty of how does the arcade controller look, feel, and most importantly, work. Welcome to the PS4 controller. This thing is relatively heavy. The whole box was like 7 kilograms. The unit itself is listed as 3.5 kilograms, 655 mils wide, 270 mil deep, and 70 mil high, not including the button's height. Initial impressions. The buttons look and feel nearly like the arcades. Of course, this being the PS4 version, all the PS4 buttons and touch panel are present. There is also a normal and arcade mode switch, which we will look at later. The analog sticks feel nice and smooth and can be pressed down for the R3, L3, or whatever the buttons you want to call them things.
The touch panel initially looks much the same as the arcades, but you'll notice the arcade has a tighter integration and a more glossy look.
Underneath, we have a warranty sticker covering a screw and a serial number in the center. The lip at the front both doubles as a good place to pick up the controller and features a headphone jack. Let's turn this thing on and see it light up in all its glory? It's not as good as the arcade. Although this particular machine seems to have a malfunctioning circle light, you can see they are much more colourful. It's a shame that the touch slider doesn't light up like a rainbow too, but hey. Actually, come to think of it, it's not even as good as the PS3 Project DIVA full-size controller lights by HORI either. You would have thought that it would have been improved or matched, right? I mean, look at that. Anyway, the HORI touch slider does light up no matter how many points you press at once, which is amazing. It is all programmed directly to the controller though. The lights are not commanded by the game, so instead you have manual control. As pointed out in the manual, hold the LED button and press up or down on the D-pad to choose your color. Actually, the arcades have a much tighter integration. The buttons or portions of the touch slider flash accordingly,
And the colors of the slider animates and changes according to the arcade game's will.
It is possible to pop the buttons off by pushing down and rotating them counterclockwise. I'd assume for simple maintenance like dust buildup removal. Perhaps this way you can dampen the buttons without voiding any warranties, as they are quite noisy. But as the entire cup moves on the button press, I'm not so sure if you can do that so well without busting out a screwdriver. It at least appears that you could do it, I guess. It also appears that with a little bit of effort, you could prop the plastic disc out of the domes and customize the look of the buttons like I've seen at the arcades too. I'm worried that if I try this that I will dent or crack the button faces, so I won't test this theory. But you can see how the button face is put in place, and with a tool you could probably remove it. Now, let's take a look at the Switch version. It appears to have a box in a box just like the PS4. The unit itself is the same dimensions, but the buttons at the top are of course different for the Switch, so no touch panel and 9 buttons instead of 8. Interestingly enough, there is no normal or arcade mode switch, and yes, the Switch version also has the headphone jack. Both controller buttons are built to the same spec, so you can swap them between controllers if you like. Oh, it may be worth pointing out that switching the buttons around will not change what the actual buttons do in-game. Like, the right button will always be circle or A, depending on which system you're playing. For that, you'd have to change the controls in the game settings. Fantastic! That's going to be confusing. I'm having an unnecessarily fun amount of time changing the buttons. Looking at the normal and arcade mode switch exclusive to the PS4 version, it changes how the touch slider works. On normal mode, the left half acts as tilting the left analog stick left or right. Same thing for the right half, only of course it's for the right stick. Switch to the arcade mode, and now every point seems to be different angles or appear to do nothing. I suspect that they appear to do nothing as they represent such small movements of the analog stick that most games apply them as a dead zone, so you don't appear to have any controller drift. As the Switch controller does not have the normal and arcade mode switch, it appears to just act like the arcade mode on the PS4. So, that just about concludes how the controller acts outside of the game it's designed for. It is time to move on to Project DIVA Future Tone. As for gameplay, the PS4 game needs to be updated to include support for the dedicated controller. You then need to turn the dedicated controller option on under Customize Game Settings. In doing so, you finally, after so many years, get the touch slider response just like the arcades, with the glorious sparkle sound as you travel up and down the touch slider. Even though the arcades are a bit noisier, these buttons do actually seem noisier. Taking a look at how the controllers behave, with the dedicated controller setting off, of course, the PS4 controller itself works as expected. The arcade controller on normal mode has the touch slider work just like in The Last of Us, so technically you could play the game like this, where you touch parts of the touch slider rather than slide across it. Switch to arcade mode and, well, since you haven't told the game yet, the touch slider works just like in The Last of Us, which is basically weird. Here you can see that you can use the analog sticks to navigate, but the interesting thing is,
On the PS4,
when you enable the dedicated controller option setting, the analog sticks instantly stop working for navigation, and going back to the song select shows that in normal mode, it seems to scroll in random directions, but in arcade mode, you can now slide or tap the L and R areas on the sides to select your song. Everything works beautifully. Interestingly, the Switch version doesn't allow slidage to select songs, only by tapping the far left and right sides. Switching back to the PS4 controller appears to make the game just go mental at the song select. In-game, even the slightest touch of the analog sticks sets off the slider sounds. It is entirely possible that you will just hear the slide sound going off all the time, as analog sticks don't always sit perfectly in the middle. Spinning the controller around doesn't do anything, so clearly all touch slider control is assigned to the analog stick signals, not like the gyro or something. On the Switch, with the dedicated controller mode on, in Song Select, the left analog stick seems to navigate down and the right up. Usually you'd use the D-pad or the far left or right parts of the touch slider. As for in-game, what if I try to use the analog sticks instead of the touch slider? Well, they kind of work. It makes sounds when you move them, which kind of makes me worry about dead zones and control stick drift, but so far so good. So I tested it. It seems that there is still a dead zone with the Switch controller sticks and the HORI controller in the actual game, so we should need not worry about a little drift-causing spastic slider nonsense. I can't figure out what direction they kind of work, and it seems that I get some notes correct, but yeah, it's a pointless exercise when you have a perfectly good touch slider. Also, side note, I absolutely can't play this game using the Switch button icons, especially with the X being in a different position. My brain just explodes. So, change it back and yeah, I can do alright. And yes, in the Switch version, you can change the button icons. HORI states that the controllers are exclusive to their respective consoles and will not work on both, so I tried. Plugging the PS4 controller into the Switch dock doesn't even prompt the controller to light up. The PSN button does nothing. Everything does nothing. Similarly, plugging the Switch controller into the PS4 also does nothing. I suspect you could get one to work on both, but you would need a third-party controller adapter, which would likely add additional lag, and I can't test which would be the best of the two to buy if you are trying your best to get your hands on one of these controllers. Having now tested these controllers, it is time to play some songs to see how it performs. After playing a few songs, I feel that the home controllers are the next best thing to actually playing at the arcade. They bounce back and respond well. In terms of the feel of the buttons after having played on both the HORI controller and heading back to the arcades, there's nothing to worry about in terms of the HORI controller buttons. The arcade ones do feel a little bit more solid as they don't wobble at all really. However, the build quality of HORI's controller is at a point where you kind of have to deliberately cause the buttons to wobble. In actual gameplay, I didn't notice. But the touch slider is like 80% as good as the arcade. Sliding left and right is no problem, but I say 80% because when trying to record the Freely Tomorrow footage, I dropped on the exact same slide note 4 times before clearing a perfect. Being the same note, I tended to try and use the exact same spot of the touch slider, and on closer inspection, I noticed that HORI's touch slider has more headroom from the LEDs than the arcade's touch slider, and this area does not register any touch. I never noticed that there was any dead zone in the arcades until I went there to deliberately test this. There is, but it is very small in comparison. You basically have to wedge your finger up against the edge of the cabinet for that to happen, making it very obvious you are reaching too far. So with HORI's controller, you do need to make sure you don't reach too far forward. Maybe you could just place a piece of foam there to stop you from reaching too far forward. Also, some headphone cables and such may trigger the touch slider, so if you are connecting your headphones to a display, you need to make sure it doesn't touch the slider. The headphone jack at the arcades is at the front, so this will never happen. I'll tell you why you want to connect your headphones to the display later. One thing that you might not think about, which I find is a big deal, is that the PS4 version of the controller actually feels slightly snappier. Is there actually less delay? Is the fact that the Switch USB ports run through a dock adding a little extra lag to wired controllers? Every setup is different, but considering this is a consistent setup, I would have thought that the experience too would be consistent. I tested this by filming at 60 frames per second and counting frames from hitting the button to seeing the note explode on screen. The Switch usually had a 6-frame delay, sometimes 5. The PS4 also had 5 or 6 frame delays, but I counted 5 frames more frequently than the Switch, so the average turned out to be a little faster. Note that there very well could be a discrepancy due to the camera and monitor's timing not being exact. Out of curiosity, I headed to the arcade to try the same thing as well, and it turns out to be very difficult to do the exact same test as the arcade lights are animated and in time with the game. But from what I can tell, it looks like there's a slight more visual delay at the arcades than using my 5-inch recorder monitor. It's quite scary because, at least from a visual standpoint, there is very little difference, yet I still felt enough of a difference to try this test. I'm not yet satisfied with these findings, so I decided to test the audio delay as well. To do this, I connected a cable from the headphone jack and a microphone to my field recorder to make sure that the timing between inputs is exactly the same. I placed or pointed the mic close to a button and whacked the button relatively hard. This is where things became even more confusing and weird. In testing the audio delay, I decided I should try all available headphone jacks just in case there is a difference. Alright, this is the headphones plugged into the controller. And there is. Have a listen yourself to me hitting the button and the in-game audio response. I tried measuring similar points in the WAV files to figure out what the input delays are, but it's pretty difficult. However, here are the averages. The PS4 shows a shocking difference in audio delay if I use the controller's headphone jack. So does the Switch. So I can't recommend using the headphone jack in the controller at all. unless your TV or display has a terrible delay. Which means, as I mentioned before, you need to make sure your headphone cable doesn't come in contact with the touch slider, as it can trigger it. As for the Switch console itself has a usable headphone jack, even while docked, and my results show, well, it seems pretty much the same as the display for me, but the audio quality isn't quite as good. Perhaps the safest route if you're not doing any recording, as it disables the HDMI audio, is to plug your headphones into the Switch, which could be set off to the side to avoid headphone cables touching touch sliders. Remember that every display is different, and you may have more or less delay than I do in these tests, but I believe that the Switch and controller headphone jacks would be consistent with my findings. Having said all that, I am still passing songs fine on the Switch, so this whole experiment is more for understanding and best practices than a deal breaker. For serious music rhythm and fighter players, I highly suggest you look into display lag and cut it down on a hardware level. Like, get a monitor or TV specifically for gaming. TV manufacturers don't seem to actually tell you what their input lag is. Displaylag.com, however, actually is dedicated to testing this. You'll be surprised to find that it's actually the cheaper displays that usually have a lower input lag. More expensive and bigger displays tend to have more input lag, and even after disabling these features or turning on game mode, there is oftentimes still more lag than a cheaper display, so go figure. Interestingly, as the Switch allows for custom t-shirts, Amazon, Geo, and the Switch HORI controllers came with bonus unlock codes to give you t-shirt designs. This, being from using the code provided on the back of the dedicated Switch controller's manual, is therefore possibly one of the most exclusive t-shirt designs in the game. Maybe any game? I don't know, but thankfully it is pretty cool. I kinda want all the t-shirt designs, but it would have been too expensive to buy the game several times. I opted for the badges and the tapestry instead. Oh, if you're interested, plugging the controller into your PC is recognized. But I didn't actually try using it. Well, that's just about everything. So, thank you all for sitting back and listening to me say a lot of things about a single controller. Hope you found it interesting and informative, and if you have any questions, feel free to ask. All of this means make sure you set the dedicated controller option on. Don't use the controller's headphone jack, and you'll likely get a better experience. Unnecessary loudness!